It should be noted at this point that I am one of history's greatest fake smokers. It's not for a lack of trying, but so much as a lack of competence and a terrible fear of cancer. So, I believe when I was 8 or 9, the neighborhood kids came around and they said, "Come out in the woods, we're all gonna go smoke." And I thought, okay, I'll do that. And we went out in the woods, and we all sat on a soggy, rotten van seat. And this was 1976 or 77. And they all lit up a stolen cigarette and then started passing it around. And these kids took a big deep puff, turned green, and handed it to the next person, and they handed it to me. And rather than actually smoking it, I just held it up to my mouth like this and went, and if you blow on a cigarette like that, instead of smoking it, what you really do is you produce a cloud of tiny little embers that fly all around the rotten van seat and land on everybody's bare legs and burn them. And everybody kept saying, "Hey, Joby, what are you doing?" And I said, "What do you mean I'm smoking?" And they said, "No, that's not smoking. What are you doing?" And I said, "No, I'm smoking. Look at me, I'm smoking cigarettes." And I took it, I said, "Look," and I very nonchalantly held it up like the old lunch lady who used to smoke outside the school. And I did this and blew as hard as I could, and the main lit part detached, flew across the rotten van seat and landed on Belinda's, one of my neighbor's, leg and burned her quite severely. And they said, "You idiot, you're not supposed to be blowing on it, you're supposed to suck on it." And I looked at them and I said, "Come on, if I did that, the smoke would go in my mouth." And they said, "Well, that's how smoking works." And I said, "Yeah, you're not gonna sucker me in on that one." But I did have this powerful draw to the cinematic quality of smoking, so I took up a lot of fake smoking. I would walk around school with a stick or a pencil or a piece of chalk and just practice gesturing with it constantly. I would point at things at the board, and my elementary school teacher would wonder why I looked like Betty Davis every time I came up to the board to do a thing, because I would be holding the chalk like this, and she says, "How are you going to write with a chalk like that?" And I said, "Darling." As I got older, I realized my flaw there, and I stopped fake smoking for the most part, except when I grew up and kind of reached that legal age, and I started going to the lovely rundown gay bars just south of DC. And I would show up and I needed a hook. So I would come in with a cigarette and I would light it and I would carry it everywhere with me and I would gesture with it. But nobody would ever see me smoke it. I just kind of carried it around and tapped it out and gestured and sat there trying to look very cool, watching the blue curls of smoke rise into the air as I sat in the corner hoping desperately that no one would talk to me or try to date me. And the problem was, back then I was sort of lonely. I was 18. But it was the heart of the Reagan years, and there was a big threat on the horizon to cover anything about possibility of dating. But more than that, I had a job that sort of insulated me from the possibility of ever having a relationship. So I'd run into people and they would say, "What do you do?" I'd say, "You mean like right now?" And they said, "No, what do you do for a living?" And I said, "Oh, I sit in a room full of poison gas and listen to people die all day." and they'd kind of take a step back, give me this very sideways look and say, "What do you mean you sit in a room full of poison gas and listen to people die every day?" And I'm like, "I'm a quality control officer for the National Transportation Safety Board, and what I do all day is I listen to crash cockpit recordings of planes where everyone was killed, and I make copies and I monitor them to make sure that I am putting out a product that accurately represents what was happening in the cabin in the last minutes of that doomed airliner." And people would step back from me and they'd say, "That's your job?" And I said, "Well, the other part is after the planes crash, the NTSB sends out reporters and they come out and take pictures of all the bodies. And I make copies of them, and then I spend the whole day in a room with a diazo process duplicator, which leaks ammonia fumes, and I use a tiny magnifying glass to look at the photos of all the people who I just heard die." And at this point, most people would sort of give me a sideways look that said in sort of the easiest possible terms, "I think I'm gonna go stand over here now, but it was nice talking to you." So I'd sit there angrily pretending to smoke and tapping out my cigarette and waiting and hoping nobody would come talk to me. And after a while of this, I decided, the best thing to do is just lie. So people would ask me, "Hey, what do you do? What do you do for a living?" And I said, "I'm in aviation." And by in aviation, I mean kind of the end of it. And they'd get very curious and ask me, "Well, what do you do in aviation?" Every once in a while, I'd get a wild hair, and instead of telling them something vaguely resembling the truth or something plausible, I would say, "I'm an airline pilot," which was problematic because I was 18, and very few 18-year-olds are airline pilots for the airlines. And so, as usual, they would back up, and they'd say, "Well, I'm gonna stand over here now, but it was nice talking to you." And I would be very nervous standing around on my own. And naturally, what I would do is I would go order a Coke and then pretend it was a rum and Coke. So I fake smoked and fake drank. And I had a fake career. And I hid in the corner, and it was perfect. I don't know why more people have not solved this essential problem of dating. Rather than actually doing anything, just sit in the corner and pretend to do all of it. And the trouble was, as I was doing this is the middle of the 80s, in the heart of Reagan's memorial AIDS epidemic. And so the bars I went to slowly emptied out, and I would still be there, holding my cigarette, gesturing at nothing, hoping no one would talk to me. And there would be fewer and fewer and fewer people around. And I remember talking to the bartender, and I would go up and ask for another Coke that I could pretend was a rum and Coke if anybody asked. And I'd ask the guy, "Where is everybody?" And the bartender at the place I used to like to go to best looked me in the eye with kind of a sad look, and he said, "Oh, honey," and he had that voice that indicated that he was not a fake cigarette smoker. He said, "Oh, honey, they're all dead. This bar is probably going to be out of business in 6 or 7 months. And you'll have to go and stand somewhere else and fake smoke your cigarettes." And all I could think was, but I like it here. I like this place, and I like my little pretend existence where I work in aviation. And when Monday rolled around, I'd go back into work. And I'd go into the little room in the back of the service bureau where I worked, and I'd turn on the pump that filled the room with toxic ammonia gas, which I could live with. It was a bit like being inside a cough drop all the time. And I'd fire up my photograph duplicator and look at all the photos of dead people. And I'd listen to the cockpit voice recorders, and as I did, I kind of sympathized with them, because usually pilots are really professional and calm, and even as they're hurtling towards the ground, the last thing they usually say isn't anything panicky or sad or scary. They're just working right up to the last minute, and at the last minute they look and they say, well, shit, recording ends. And I found a lot of time in the 80s, I was kind of pretending to be around and alive and fully invested in the world. And one of my favorite things to do, which I always assumed was comparatively normal, was that I would go along the route of the Potomac, and I would get situated right by the water gate with a pair of powerful binoculars and just stare into everybody's apartment. I'd stare into their apartments and I'd just think, man, it's crazy how people live. They all sure have a lot of stuff. And there was one particular one that you could see right around the bend of where the road kind of followed the river around between the office building side of the Watergate and the residential part. And there was one particular apartment that had a bright neon blue star, about 6 feet tall. And I would look into there, and all the furniture was modern and beautiful and crazy. And I thought, I'm gonna live like that one day. And I used to kind of time it, and there was a guy that would come home in that apartment, and I would see him come in and throw his coat on a chair. And then he would put on a pair of headphones and start dancing, and I thought, man, this guy is living the life. He is living the life like a rich person in the middle of the horror of the Reagan years. And I thought, I want to be just like this guy. Except over the course of months, I watched him get smaller and weaker. And he would dance a while, and then he would stop, and he would look frustrated. And then he would just sort of lump out of the room. And I'd watch a little while, and nothing would happen. And I started feeling like, God, I think this guy's sick. I think there's something wrong with him. And then for a time, he would come into the room in front of that blue star, and he would just stand there, and I would just be watching. And I don't know, I always felt like, I sure hope that guy does not see me watching him through my binoculars. And then one day, I went out to look, and he never came back. And I looked again, and he didn't come back. And for months, it was just this empty apartment with that blue star. An empty apartment and a bright blue star beckoning to me to look, what's going on? What is happening? But I knew. But again, in those days, I was good at pretending. So I would just look up there and I'd see that blue star, and I told myself a little story. One day, when that man was having a hard time after work, that's when his fairy godmother came. That's when she came and swept into the house, dressed in her work clothes, and scooped him up and gave him a hug and smoothed his hair and took him home. And after that, I put my binoculars away. I got a different job where I was delivering pizza instead. It didn't pay as much, but not as many people died, as far as I could tell. And I kind of stayed in my own space and lived my own way. And it was good. But this isn't really a sad story. It's just one how kind of the power of telling stories is that you can make them go the way you want. Not always, but enough. And I had to remember around the same time I was learning how to pretend to smoke with a bunch of angry Skaggsville teenagers where I lived. Right around the same time, I achieved one of my life dreams in that Julie Andrews came to the local performance venue where we lived. And my dad knew that I was crazy about Julie Andrews, which years later he would say, well, really, I should have known. And we watched Julie Andrews. This was at Merriweather Post Pavilion, which if you are from the DC area, you will know is the worst place to see any performance ever. And I was 8 or 9, and I was thinking I was gonna see this great show and it was going to be great, but instead I was a mile away and I could hardly hear anything and I could hardly see anything, and everything was just terrible. And at the end of the show, my dad picked up on the fact that I was really unhappy. And he goes, kid, I'm sorry. I kind of thought this would be better. And what he did is he snuck me backstage in the way my dad usually did things. He just sort of blustered in there as if he belonged. And that was a skill I learned eventually. But he blustered his way in there, and he went backstage and he found Julie Andrews. And he said, Miss Andrews, this is my son Joe. He really wants to meet you. And I looked up at Julie Andrews, and I was so excited, and she was so real, and I could not believe I was sitting there with Julie Andrews actually there. And midway through it, I looked at her and I don't know what to say. I can't believe I'm really with Julie Andrews. And I looked at her and I said, oh, Miss Andrews, you're one of my biggest fans. And Julie Andrews looked me right in the eye, and she put a hand out, and when I put my hand out, she did that thing that really kind people do where they take both sides of your hand, and she looked me right in the eye, and she said, I am your biggest fan. And at that moment, I knew somehow my life had changed, and that I could always access that moment where, for all the bad jobs and all the bad places and all the bad things that were happening around me, all the things I couldn't stop or protect or sort out. I could always look in the mirror at the beginning of a day where I dreaded everything. I could look into the mirror, catch myself right in the eyes and say, Julie Andrews is my biggest fan. And that's something.